Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai. Welcome to what is our 10th webinar for the LDAC webinar series. And it's about what it's like to meet with LDAC, the first contact with the Secretariat, and all the way through to letters of advice. My name's Guy Beatson. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee, and I'm a non-public service member. In my day job, I'm the General Manager of the Governance Leadership Centre, which is the Governance Centre of Excellence for the Institute of Directors, as well as being the Registrar in charge of professional standards. In today's webinar, we're going to cover three key areas: what LDAC actually is, and who the members are, and how it operates. We're going to turn to when to come to LDAC and how bills and prospective bills end up being discussed with LDAC subcommittees and what that experience kind of looks like. And then we're very lucky today to have two people who have actually had this experience. So we're going to conclude my discussion with the panel by talking to two people who have first-hand experience engaging with LDAC and how this went for them, including one person who's actually been engaged with LDAC in the last week or so. And then there's an opportunity. So let's first turn to our panel. Let's get them to introduce themselves. We'll start with Stuart.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Stuart McGilvray. I have been a member of LDAC since 2019. My day job, I am the Chief Legal Advisor to the Office of the Ombudsman.
And Beth.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Beth Goodwin. I'm the Manager of the Employment Relations Policy Team at MB.
And last but not least, Stacey.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Stacey O'Dowd, an Immigration Policy Manager at MB.
Thank you very much to all, and we'll come back to Stacey and Beth a bit later on in our conversation this morning. So shortly, I'm going to talk to the panel, particularly starting with Stuart. But before I do that, can I encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A button at the top of your screen? That's the one next to chat. So don't use the chat one, use the Q&A button. And don't wait until the end of the panel discussion. You can ask those questions you've got at any time, and we'll try to answer as many of them in the time available after the panel discussion. So let's turn to the foundations for LDAC. And I want to talk to Stuart about where members for the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee come from.
Sure, thanks, Guy. So the members of LDAC come from a very wide range of different backgrounds, and we all bring different experience and skills to the role. What brings us together is a common interest in good legislative design. So we're all appointed by the Attorney General. We have a mixture of public service members and non-public service members. For example, when I first joined LDAC in 2019, I worked at the Ministry of Social Development and I was a public service member. Now that I work for the Ombudsman, I am an external public service member. An external member of LDAC. We currently have 22 members of LDAC. We have people with strong backgrounds in policy. We have a range of different lawyers, people who work in-house in government, external barristers as well, people with social policy experience, economists like yourself, Guy, people working in Crown entities, some academics and consultants as well. We think this really broad range of experience and skills is important because good legislative design is multidisciplinary. Because there are non-public service members on LDAC, like myself, we have processes in place to enable members to receive draft legislation and have discussions about policy issues before they've gone to Cabinet. Basically, the Attorney General has delegated the authority for that to happen to the external members. We're all bound by confidentiality, so everything you tell us is confidential, and we have processes in place as well to manage possible conflicts of interest that come up. So as someone who's been at both ends, when I was working at the Ministry of Justice as a policy advisor, I came to LDAC quite a few times. I know it can be a little bit intimidating to come along, but what I'd encourage everyone to think of LDAC as is kind of like your critical friends. We're there to try and help you work through and identify solutions to really tricky legislative design issues, and we do that drawing on our collective experience.
Yeah, it's a really nice message, Stuart, and I think the other thing that you're picking up on is the fact that there's a real strong commitment from all of the LDAC members to quality legislation because of the impact that we all know as members of LDAC, whether we're non-public service or public service members, about the effects of that. So you've started to talk a little bit about what it's like to come to LDAC. So can you briefly run us through what LDAC does and what type of advice we provide officials?
Sure. So as you've just touched on, Guy, our mandate is to promote quality legislation. We do that broadly in 3 different ways. We advise departments, and we do that early in the development of policy and legislation to try and resolve issues in the design of legislation and potential public and constitutional law issues. The second way we work is by setting standards, and we'll talk briefly in a minute about the legislation guidelines, and LDAC's role is to maintain them and keep them up to date. We also publish supplementary material to kind of elaborate on legislative design issues in a bit more detail. And thirdly, we kind of scrutinise bills that are going through Parliament, and from time to time you may see or hear us making submissions at Select Committee on bills where we think issues of consistency with the guidelines arise. So in doing this work, we're not concerned with critiquing the policy objectives of legislation. We do need to understand really clearly what the policy objectives are, because our focus is on good legislative practice and public law issues. The other thing we do, and today's evidence of that, is that we run seminars on legislative design, and we're, as you said, Guy, I think this is the 10th in the series, and they're really helpful, designed to give people an overview of common legislative design issues and what our role is.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you think about the first part of our conversation, we're saying that we've got a bunch of people with some really good experience. They've got really strong links to legislation. They're committed to getting good legislative design. I think there may be sometimes there's a suspicion that we just kind of across all of our membership just make it up, and that's not true. So officials meeting with LDAC can expect advice that links to the legislation guidelines, as you've said. I think sometimes there's a bit of mystery about what those guidelines are and where they've come from and that kind of stuff. Can you briefly cover what the guidelines are, please?
Sure thing. Yeah, so the guidelines, as you say, they're our framework. They're the framework we use for assessing and analysing legislative design issues. They've been around for a while, and the most recent edition, 2021, was endorsed by Cabinet, and it's been endorsed by Cabinet as a governance key point of reference for assessing whether legislation conforms with accepted legal and constitutional principles. Those of you familiar with drafting Cabinet papers will know that ministers and officials have to advise Cabinet of aspects of bills that depart from the legislative guidelines, and to justify those departures. I would really encourage anyone who's working on legislative development in government, to familiarise themselves with the guidelines, and certainly have a look at Chapter 1, which gives a very succinct and helpful overview of what good legislative design is and why it matters. The guidelines are pretty substantial. There's 29 chapters, over 150 specific guidelines on common legislative design issues. They're set out as principles, and they're intended to be an aid to officials faced with producing legislation. And they're not meant to be a hurdle to overcome, and they're not there to second guess policy decisions that ministers want to progress. The principle-based nature of the guidelines reflect that good design is not black and white. It's about articulating the key issues and trade-offs, and then helping ministers to make informed choices about how to proceed. So yeah, as I say, start with Chapter 1, certainly, if you're working in policy and legislative development in government, to get your head around the task. I think of the guidelines as a bit of an FAQ, or kind of like a Bible, or a set of conventions on good legislative design. And they're really critical to supporting ministers to achieve their objectives.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? I guess the other message we can deliver is that, in fact, this is not something to read from cover to cover. Chapter 1's really helpful, but there are various pieces of it that, in terms of various policy issues to translate into legislation, you can pick into, and your legal advisors can help you do that. So pulling those threads together, LDAC is providing advice on good legislative design. So it's not providing advice on policy. LDAC is here to support you to ensure your bill achieves its policy objectives. And just to reinforce, LDAC's goal is high quality legislation. It's a part of how we try and help with that task, and that's what we're there for. But also the legislation guidelines themselves, they can help you and play your role, and those guidelines are a really big part of what we do. So we've talked, Stuart, about the what piece of this, who LDAC is, what it is, how it kind of works. But when you come to LDAC, I guess there's a bit of a mystery around this. If you've never done this before, and we're going to talk a little bit to Stacey and to Beth about that in a moment, what is that engagement with LDAC? How does it begin?
Yep. So at the start of each calendar year, LDAC reviews all the legislative bids, which people will be familiar with, to identify bills that we think raise legislative design issues and which we would like officials to come and chat to us about. As you might know, if you're involved in that legislation bid process, the bids themselves have to signal any potential design issues. And roughly each year there are 50 bills which indicate where officials indicate they would like to come to LDAC. On average, we see about 35 to 40 bills a year. Not all the bills that LDAC engages on were bills where people said they would like to engage us. So there's some things that we might pick up ourselves and indicate we'd like to talk to you. It is ultimately for agencies to decide if they want to engage with us, but we certainly encourage it, and we see it as a helpful process for officials. So we do that exercise at the start of each year, but as everyone knows, despite the best intentions of the legislative bid process, other work comes up during the course of the year. And COVID would be the prime example of the leg bid cycle getting disrupted and new and complex legislation having to be developed at pace. So we encourage officials to engage with us as early as they can on design issues that come up in that process as well. Acknowledging it can be especially difficult to work through novel issues at pace. We're there to try and help with that process.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting too. I mean, I think we've observed that mostly policy teams are driving the engagement with LDAC, and that surprises me a little bit. I mean, you would have thought the guardians of legislative design would be the legal team, so I guess we'd encourage them to take a more active role in terms of the thinking process around bringing bills or prospective bills to LDAC. So whether it's through the leg bid process or at a later stage, how do you think an official, and I guess getting back to that, whether that's a policy official or someone in the legal teams, how would they determine when they should be meeting with LDAC?
Yeah, the starting point for me would be that if you're at all concerned about any aspects of your bill and any design issues that come up, do come and see us. It's a little bit sad, but we all really enjoy talking about legislative design issues. And so I guess to kind of summarize that, we're primarily concerned with legislative proposals that are or appear to be inconsistent with the legislative guidelines. So again, to familiarize yourself with those as you're developing policy. Proposals which involve significant amendments to a principal act or the creation of a new standalone act. Proposals that involve complex interactions across the statute book, which obviously is quite common, or where there's a degree of overlap or interaction with other legislation, and also legislation which involves fundamental constitutional and legal principles. So if your proposal is new, novel, or gnarly, LDAC's likely to be interested in seeing it and able to help you work through the issues that are arising. We've got a series of helpful documents, but one document in particular on our website, which outlines the specific factors to consider in deciding whether to consult with us. So do have a look on our website, it's really helpful.
Yeah, I guess the other thing, just a bit more of a promo, and these webinars, all 10 of them, are now on our YouTube channel for LDAC as well. So if you're not a reader or you just want to get to grips with some of those key points, then you can look at the YouTube channel as well. So just to pull the threads of that together, while you're required to indicate whether you want to see LDAC in your legislative bid, you can always contact us to meet either way. Our website, as I've talked about, has a whole host of helpful resources, helping guidance on when you should come to LDAC and the guidelines checklist that you can use to review the bill against the guidelines. I guess I want to emphasize also, though, that this is a question of legislative design. LDAC doesn't actually get into the policy pieces of this, and maybe that's a hard thing to comprehend, but it's real, and I think Stuart and I would both attest to that, eh?
Definitely. Yep.
Anyway, so now we've talked about LDAC and our perspective on that and how it might come about and the sort of conversations that have. We're going to turn to some people who've had real experience of doing that. So we're lucky to have Beth and Stacey, who can provide that external point of view and provide helpful information on engaging with LDAC, and also some advice to others about how to do this, how to start it. So let's turn to Beth and then Stacey with the same question. How did you begin to engage with LDAC, Beth?
Cool. I think this is quite good because Stacey and I might have slightly contrasting experiences. Mine was a few years ago, which also means I could probably talk a little bit more about the content of what we talked about. We were invited to meet with LDAC. This was about 4 years ago, and it was reasonably early in the policy process, which is probably why we hadn't thought to contact LDAC ourselves. But our policy was, in brief, to design the fair pay agreements system, which was a new kind of collective bargaining, which would be bound by unions and employer associations, and apply to the entire kind of workforce that it covered. There had been a working group report recommending kind of the core tenets of design of the system, and I think it was off the back of that LDAC identified that this was going to be quite a novel type of legislation, so invited us to come. We prepared a briefing, a memo for LDAC, which was mostly repurposing existing material, but we had in mind the kind of LDAC as the audience. It would have been, I don't know, five or 6 pages long with the core, where we were at with it, what the history was, what our constraints were, and what the key issues were that we thought would be really helpful to get LDAC's opinion on.
That's great. No, and obviously that wasn't a painful experience. We'll turn to Stacey now, because you've had a more recent experience. How did that engagement with LDAC begin?
Well, you'll be pleased that our legal team suggested that we should reach out to LDAC. We have a couple of proposals that were quite complex and gnarly, so it was suggested at an early stage of the policy process to reach out and front foot and get expert advice of how we could work through those proposals.
That's good. I mean, and did you initiate that, or did LDAC Secretariat initiate your contact with LDAC?
Yeah, I reached out to LDAC and it was really easy, and we were working to tight timeframes, and LDAC was able to accommodate us to have a meeting within the next week and then provide that feedback relatively quickly after the meeting as well. So yeah, it was quite a seamless process and not as daunting or as intimidating as people might perceive.
The timing one's important too, eh? I mean, just a quick reminder to our audience today, you can ask questions of our panel, whether that's Stuart or Beth or Stacey, or possibly even me, depending on what the questions are. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom, the top of your screen. So be really good to have a few questions from you as we go through. I'm sure there's some already, but try that Q&A button out and we'll see how we get on. So I want to talk to Beth briefly about what the impact of coming to LDAC was. And were you dealing with particularly gnarly issues, or was it just kind of run of the mill, we just got to go through the process? Tell us about your experience and that impact in terms of that visit.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, there were gnarly issues. I mean, it was a novel and complex regulatory system that we were kind of setting up. The cool thing was that LDAC got the issues straight away. That was, I mean, it's those of us who are regulatory policy nerds. It's great to meet with other regulatory policy nerds because people understand the issues that you're grappling with and the things that you're trading off. So LDAC really got that. We were considering, we had wider constraints than just considering pure legislative policy design. And so they got that, and they weren't going to say you must do it our way. They were offering an expert kind of point of view. So maybe an example, one of the issues we were grappling with was that the government of the day wanted these fair pay agreements to have force of law beyond the people who had bargained and signed them. So there needed to be some mechanism to have to bind people beyond those signatories. But the contents needed to be bargained and needed to stay true to what the participants had bargained. So it was an unusual circumstance where it was going to have force of law, but without government and parliament having complete control over the content of them. And so LDAC advised us how to balance those, having good regulatory design with enabling the parties to have that freedom to bargain what they wanted the terms to be. And so one one point that LDAC honed in on was that it would be very important to be clear about who was and wasn't covered by this, what was going to be a new law. Essentially, the idea was that we would incorporate this agreement by regulation. And so the suggestion was that perhaps the description of who was covered would have some involvement of the government. Perhaps PCO might be involved in drafting that, but the actual terms of the agreement could be incorporated. And they drew an analogy with how treaties are considered, which is something we hadn't thought of. I'll stop there.
Yeah. So, but what you're describing, Beth, just to pick into that slightly, is more of a conversation and a teasing through a problem rather than an inquisition. Is that the nature of the experience you had?
Yeah, definitely. They the members honed in on even more than us on what would be the tricky issues, and recognized that they were asking us a lot of questions about what we'd thought of so far, but were also suggesting other considerations, parallel scenarios that we could incorporate. And essentially the goal was that we could provide the minister with advice that was within the constraints of what the minister wanted, to achieve, while also bringing in that aspect of, well, here would be the best way to design that so that you stay true to legislative design principles as well. So I think they helped us get that blend. And so how we used LDAC's advice was it was incorporated into our advice to the minister. It was basically a further data point or evidence point to show, well, you've got options, and this is the one that LDAC suggests is the most consistent with their guidelines. So we presented it kind of as it's a further information for the minister. Of course, ultimately, it's the minister's decision and cabinet's.
Yeah, and I guess that's right. And there's that kind of critical friend element of that as well, but supportive of officials, and that's the key message from this. I want to turn to Stacey now. You've had more recent experience, Stacey, and you've obviously had a bit of chance with your team to reflect on your engagement with LDAC. So if you were to share just a few tips about coming to LDAC with the people on the webinar today, what sort of things would you point to?
Well, I've thought of 3, and many of them have largely been covered through the discussion that you and Stuart have had. So the first would definitely be engage early in your policy process. The wealth and knowledge that the members have means that you're able to greatly improve your legislative design and tease out any issues that may arise later in the process, so you're able to identify them and manage them sooner rather than later. The second would be, as part of preparing your information to submit to LDAC ahead of the meeting, would be to refer to the LDAC guidelines. This was particularly important for the cover memo. So you have approximately an hour for the discussion. So you want to focus on those issues that are most tricky or complex, and the guidelines help you frame the key questions or issues that you have in a way that can be easily addressed and understood. Yeah, basically helps you get to the heart of the issue quickly. And then the third would be continue to seek feedback or advice from LDAC throughout your process, particularly where you get stuck. So our first engagement was in July with LDAC, and then we went back last week because there's this tricky issue that we continue to work through. And it's been really helpful because we found ourselves internally grappling with it, and then being able to discuss that with people who have a broader experience and far deeper legislative design experience than us was helpful. And I guess that reassurance that this is hard and people are there to help you, which has been fantastic.
You've raised a real interesting point, Stacey, that I hadn't really thought about before, and that is the kind of that guidelines piece. But if the guidelines are used to frame the memo in terms of those key issues, and officials have thought about that both from legal teams and policy teams, and LDAC members are coming at it using that same framework, that makes the conversation easier, do you think? Do you think that's right?
Definitely, because you're on the same page in a sense, and you're able to kind of prepare for the discussion easier and anticipate questions and do your homework in advance. So you are really making the most of the time that you have with LDAC. The other thing would also be that it is quite a learning opportunity. Going through this process, you become more familiar with the guidelines and then how to think about legislative design and get support and guidance from people who are the experts here.
Yeah, no, it's good. Hey, just for our audience, if you have questions on the basis of the conversation so far, please use the Q&A button at the bottom, the top of the screen. We've found at least one person who's found a way to use the Q&A button. I'd encourage more of you to do that as well. Hey, I want to go back to Beth briefly, and it comes out of some of the stuff that Stacey's just been talking about too. Do you think that this kind of, and you engaged relatively early with LDAC in the policy process, I think. Do you think actually starting to think about almost the legislation piece as the implementation side of it? How did that start to influence the way you thought about the policy design? And that's not the purpose of LDAC, clearly. But do you think there was that kind of linkage back that got you thinking about some of those other policy design questions as well as the legislation design questions?
Yeah, it did. And it helped us kind of work out what was the actual nature of the question that we were asking, because we were asking for obviously very subject-specific questions, but it helped us to take it up a level and ask it almost a conceptual level. So one example that jumps to mind for me is we needed to our law needed to have a bunch of decision makers at various points in the system we were creating. And instead of thinking about which entity, LDAC helped us to think about, well, what's the function that they're doing? And the function should be the thing that you first identify. Is this a judicial function? Is it an administrative function? Is it more a policy function? And that helps you then deduce, okay, so how does that help narrow down what type of entity should be making that decision? So it helped us, I guess, it helped lift us out of our detail and think about things at a more abstract in a good way, legislative design, because it helped our policy advice be more principled, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because my question was sparked by my own experience having had, and I should have said at the beginning, I was a public servant for 20-something years, working on legislation and legislation design. So that helps. But one of the LDAC piece, in terms of what you've said, is one bit of it. And then I've also found that the drafters start asking those really hard questions that sort of say, now, how did you really intend to implement this policy? You know, what functions did you really intend these people to have? I see Stacey nodding ahead to that too. Do you want to just reflect on your experience of that?
Yeah, I think the fact that we have engaged with LDAC and, like Beth was saying, the questions that are asked do get you thinking on a different level and really in that legislative design mindset, and it just means that you are able to engage more with your legal team and then respond to the questions that PCO are asking through the process. I think for many people in policy, some regulatory systems, it's not typical to work on legislation. And so if you go to LDAC at the first stage, it does really set you up through for the rest of that process there. And you understand where the drafters are coming from as well, because they are thinking about the statute book and what does best practice legislative design look like. I think it also provides PCO with confidence in your process and your policy proposals, the fact that you have gone to LDAC too.
Yeah, when it's interesting, actually, you make a really good point. It's kind of like having an extension of your policy and legal team you can call on and have discussion with a bunch of people experience you wouldn't necessarily have access to otherwise. So we're going to round out this with a couple of things. One is I've got a final question for Beth and Stuart and Stacey, and then I'll talk about the overall shape of what this webinar has been about and the sort of points that have been made. So let me go back to Beth first. So if you were our marketing team for LDAC, and you were going to sell LDAC in 3 bullet points, what is the key benefit of coming to LDAC in your view?
Okay, I would say that you've got the benefit of experts who are experts in the in legislative design overall. So they're a much higher level bird's eye view of what's good rather than any individual person and any individual policy team can have. And so that can only benefit because there's no policy problem that is unique. There's always parallels somewhere else that has happened somewhere else. And with having a bunch of expert minds in the room, it's way easier to access this is like something completely different over here. Maybe you should look at that. So it would be it's an efficient way to like really step up the inputs to your policy design. I don't think that was 3 bullets, but that's my pick.
like a typical policy person, not answering the question. Well, you still did sort of. That's all right. Same question to Stacey. You're part of our marketing team. 3 bullets that would persuade people to come and engage with LDAC and see the benefits of it.
Well, I don't know who came up with this saying, but a problem shared is a problem halved. So, like I've said, the first reason we reached out to LDAC was because we had a tricky issue, and that has continued to be the case. And so we're able to seek that advice. And again, like Beth said, it's much more efficient, and I think it helps keep the motivation up as well, because you have this wider team helping you work through tricky things.
Nice. And I guess if we can turn to Stuart with that same question at the other end of that telescope to some extent. So you're part of the marketing team too now. 3 bullets that would give some advice to people about the benefits of coming to LDAC.
Thanks, Guy. I think one thing we haven't mentioned is the benefit of us kind of being at a distance from the policy development and the drafting process. We can come in and offer, I think, in some ways, an independent critique and raise questions that you might not have thought of. Stacey and Beth have touched on this, but there's a really wide range of expertise on LDAC, which you can draw on, and I'd really encourage people to do that. The third, I would say, we have a real focus on trying to solve problems. We're not there to try and trip officials up or create hurdles. We really enjoy trying to work through the different ways of tackling the design issues that arise. So it's, very much a kind of problem-solving approach that we take.
Yeah, I really like that point, Stuart. I mean, it is about helping and collectively solve those issues that arise, but also identifying them. Some of this is about some stuff you don't see or you don't anticipate. So I think that's pretty important. So I just want to sum up. If people have questions, the Q&A button at the top of the screen is the way to do that. We've got a few, but I've encouraged our audience to questions if they have them. So just to sum up, LDAC is here to help you ensure your bill is fit for purpose. Coming to LDAC is, as you've heard this morning from Beth and from Stacey, a positive and helpful experience. But engagement is most successful when departments have thought about and identified the key design issues that you think are going to arise. And that includes making that connection to the guidelines specifically, as both Stacey and Beth have talked about. Really important to communicate clearly what advice you're seeking from LDAC, and that comes from working out whether or not there's going to be design issues associated with it. You can get in touch with LDAC through the Secretariat. We've got a very able Secretariat based in PCO. The LDAC website, www.ldac.org.nz, has all the contact information needed if you can't work out who to call. And our website also has helpful resources for, like the document we mentioned, which lists reasons to come to LDAC, but there's a whole range of other things too, including the YouTube channel linkages and links to the guidelines. So let's now turn to a few questions from our audience. And thought we might just start with you, Stuart. Does LDAC provide support with just primary legislation or regulations, or regulations too? So is it just covering primary legislation, or does LDAC get into that tertiary legislation as well?
It's a really good question. Our focus is on primary legislation. I suspect if we were to try and look at all the regulations going through, we'd have to quadruple in size. The focus of the guidelines is on primary legislation. There are, however, 4 chapters which deal with issues arising when you're designing primary legislation, which is looking to enable secondary legislation. So I think they're chapters 14 through to 17, and they deal with specific issues, quite tricky issues that can arise in empowering secondary legislation. So really encourage people to take a look at that. And while we don't scrutinise or review secondary legislation, a lot of what we say in the guidelines may be helpful if you're grappling with an issue in secondary legislation. So there may still be some utility in checking what the guideline says there as well.
I guess the other thing with that is sometimes there are enabling provisions in primary legislation that relate to secondary legislation too. But I think oftentimes we're not dealing as LDAC with the regulations themselves, but we are dealing with situations where we've had some suggestions from some departments that said, oh, we just need a regulatory arrangement, tertiary legislation, we haven't worked out what the fundamental underlying policy is. So that's probably not that great in that context, or it'll just be quicker. And part of what LDAC's doing in terms of the feedback on those things, even though it's not about the tertiary legislation, is about what role Parliament should play, what role the executive should play, and referring back to the guidelines in the way that Stuart's talked about. So let me turn to another question. So, and I'll pitch this to Beth first, and then we'll go to Stacey. That'll give Stacey a bit of time to think about it. Given your experience discussing proposed or draft bills with LDAC at different stages, is there anything you learned from the process that you would do differently that you'd want to share with our audience today?
Yes, I would relax earlier. So it's definitely, it's a daunting prospect when you first are going to go to LDAC. And definitely people might have the impression that it will be like a grilling or something, but the more that you can be open and sharing of the problems and what you are finding hard, like it takes guts to say, hey, look, this is actually really a hard issue we're struggling with. The quicker you can get to that point, the quicker that you'll get value out of it, because if you were to go in defensive, I don't remember if we were, but I definitely was nervous. If you go in defensive and being like, oh, I've got to show that we're doing a really good job, you just won't get the value. You won't get to like discussing the hard issues and what you're finding hard about it. You won't get there as fast. So that would be my top tip.
Now, I guess what you're basically saying is it's not a test. This is a way of saying actually there's some pretty damn difficult issues in the midst of all of this. And as you said earlier, some of these things, there's nothing new particularly under the sun, but there's different angles and different contexts, and I think that's pretty important. What would you say in relation to that, Stacey, given your experience to date?
I think it would be to go to LDAC earlier if you've been for your first discussion, and then subsequently if there are complex things, go sooner rather than later. While we have gone back, I think we would have benefited in terms of the process and timing by seeking that advice probably a month or so earlier. So probably keeping LDAC in the forefront of your mind as part of your wider team then enables you to think, all right, I'm stuck. Is this something we can reach out to LDAC on?
I guess that means, though, Stacey, that the policy design still needs to be, relatively well thought through before you get to that point. Do you want to just talk about the bit of the balancing act that goes on with that?
Yeah. So I think for us, this is during drafting and post cabinet. So it's been open in terms of once you have cabinet agreement to policy proposals, the process doesn't end there. How do you get it right and focus on the outcomes all the way through to the point of introduction and beyond?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, and so you can't have it kind of fully formed, but you can't have it so kind of amorphous that you're not going to get good advice. I think that's and that's a bit of a tricky balance. I think that's one of the reasons to talk to the Secretariat about this. I want to turn to Stuart, the lawyer, now. And one of the obvious questions that departments ask us, and as part of this engagement, is LDAC advice legally privileged?
It's a very good question, Guy.
So how do we think about that?
Yeah, well, our view is that it's not privileged, and the simple reason for that is the letter of advice which we generate at the end of our engagement with officials is not legal advice. It's not signed out by lawyers, so we don't view it as legally privileged. As someone who works for the Ombudsman, I can tell you, though, there may be other withholding grounds in the OI which apply if you were to receive a request with the advice that we received. And what we encourage people to do, just good OI practice, just engage with LDAC if you ever do get a request like that, and we may provide comment to you.
It occurs to me, though, as we say that and the other reason is not legal advice, is for kind of reasons that both Beth and Stacey and you have talked about, and that is it's advice for sure, but it comes out of the quite tricky space between policy and turning that into good legislation. And so it kind of sits in the middle of this. It's not like policy advice given by a department. It's it's something different. Did you have a view about that?
Yeah, I like the way you kind of pose that, Guy. We're somewhere in between the policy development, the drafting, which PCO do, which obviously is subject to legal privilege. So yeah, we're kind of in that translating policy into law process and giving advice. And again, like I said earlier, the point of reference for us is the guidelines. It's they to some extent reflect legal principle, but they are not. We're not providing legal advice about those guidelines.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we've got one or two other questions. We might just have to throw this to everyone, and we'll see how we get on. The question is, does LDAC provide support guidance on issues with existing primary legislation, either how to go about complying with certain provisions within existing legislation? I don't know, Beth, whether that's an issue that you confronted, but do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, if you were in that situation in a different piece of legislation or different policy than you were dealing with, is that something you would have sought advice from LDAC about?
If it was about complying with legislation, I wouldn't have thought so. That feels like legal advice at that point. But maybe something that is related would be, that often legislation doesn't sit purely on its own. It is in a wider, it's part of their wider statute book. And so courts are always going to be looking at intersections between different legislation. So I think it's important to consider how will the bill that you're developing interact with others. LDAC might have some views on how to think about that part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess part of that's about enforcement. Do you have a view about that, Stuart?
Yeah, I agree with Beth. I think the question as it's posed is one that is probably for your in-house legal team, Crown Law. We do have issues that come up when we're looking at legislative design about the extent to which it is necessary to legislate. So some behind the question here might be a kind of what do we need to do to comply with a particular law? Well, there may be other laws out there which provide a baseline for what you should be doing, which you might not have considered. So again, I think it's about having a really good understanding of the legislative framework you're operating in, which may not just be one act, it may be a whole series of different acts which inform what you're meant to be doing.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice. I'm going to turn back to Stacey now, not with that question, but a different one. You've obviously met with LDAC, and your team has met with LDAC a number of times now. And so when you have met with LDAC more than once, did you see the same committee members or did they change?
Yeah, we saw the same committee members, and so the value of that is the members are familiar with what you are focused on, and our second meeting was half an hour, so you could focus on that particular issue and get straight to it. You didn't need to provide all of the context. The other benefit was I was able to provide an email to the Secretariat that summarised where we were at and had the key question that we wanted to discuss. So I found the committee and the Secretariat really flexible in terms of setting up the meeting, and then I wouldn't say it was less informal, but the fact that we could use email to quickly provide the information just meant that it was really helpful and didn't place unnecessary stress on us to turn something around quickly.
And I guess that's a really important point about efficiency, right? And part of what you described is actually you got to know the Secretariat, you got to know some of the people on the committee, so they kind of knew what the issues were. So you weren't having to rehearse all of that. You then got into the substance of it much more quickly. What's your view of that, Stuart?
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea to keep open the idea of it coming back to us. Although it's not a kind of different aspect to that, although we're not there to kind of critique the drafting that you come up with, sometimes it can be helpful if you've engaged with us on a particular design issue to then come back and ask us, well, how do you think this drafting looks? And we often, I don't think we've mentioned yet, but our engagement with officials often is alongside the drafter that you're working with at PCO. So sometimes there's a bit of a three-way conversation we get going, and there's been 2 or 3 instances where I've been on committees where people have come back, and I think that engagement's been really useful.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Hey Beth, I just wanted to turn back to you briefly. You talked about, and I think Stacey's talked about this a little bit too, about kind of this question of novelty. So trying to do new things. How did you work out that you had something novel? And if you were thinking about that and you were looking forward and you're providing advice to our audience today about that, how do they think about that stuff? How do they go about identifying that level of novelty?
Oh, I think your grey mouth Wi-Fi connection. Could you just repeat that, Guy? You got a bit garbled
So
there.
I got a bit garbled. So maybe that's me talking. You talked about novelty and the issues you took to LDAC. How did you know it was novel, and what sort of advice would you provide to our audience today about identifying those kind of novel issues?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, we knew our policy was novel because nowhere in the world has a system where an agreement that is going to create employment minimum standards is bargained and then force of law, not in the same way that was kind of the constraints that we were given by the government of the day. So if it's the first time in the world, it's probably novel, is the first thing. But what LDAC helped us identify was what all the aspects of it were that were novel. And we went with, some questions. And I think you've heard from all the speakers today that knowing your questions or your having identified the points that you want to discuss is really important because it helps focus the conversation. But also the benefit, the nice bonus that we found is that some LDAC members said, hey, there's actually this other aspect of your system that you should also be thinking really carefully about because of this and this and this, which, isn't necessarily what you want to hear, but it will come up later anyway, right? It'll come up at select committee. It'll come up when you're trying to implement the thing. So the earlier that someone who's knowledgeable can say, hey, we can also see that this is novel or tricky, put some hard attention on that. It's better to know earlier. So that was a really good benefit, I found.
You've raised a really good point, though, that there are some things that policy advisors and legal teams haven't thought of that come out of those discussions that, in fact, in some ways, nobody's really thought of. It just comes up in the way the conversation runs. And that's an added benefit I don't think we've talked about in this conversation previously. Can I just turn back to Stacey too? You've obviously had several discussions with an LDAC subcommittee, and obviously the big issues you wanted to take to the subcommittee went to it, presumably in the first meeting. Presumably you came across some more minor things. Do you want to talk briefly about that? How those minor issues kind of arose, and the way in which you've engaged with LDAC and the LDAC subcommittee on those things?
Yeah, they arose during the drafting process with PCO. So we had discussions with PCO and our legal team and within our policy team, and it just reached the point where we needed to go back and kind of have that objective arm's length perspective brought into the conversation.
And how did that go? Was it seen as kind of just a minor trivial thing, or was it actually quite useful to have that engagement?
Oh, definitely useful. Yeah. As I'd said before, my lesson was we probably went back. We could have gone back earlier. Yeah. So just in terms of alternate perspectives provided, and then the comment, the acknowledgement that this was difficult. I think people all breathed a sigh of relief that we weren't just kind of spinning, it wasn't us. Yeah, so that helped the team.
That sounds like a really useful piece of assurance from
Yeah.
from the sound of it, right? Hey Beth, I just we've talked a bit about the guidelines and not really picked into it too much. Are you able to talk a little bit about how your team and you use the guidelines in preparing for the engagement with LDAC and afterwards?
I guess it helps to frame what your issue is, was my, and I'm sorry, this is a few years ago, so I can't remember the specifics, but the LDAC guidelines can help frame what your how to describe the issue in the right way so that LDAC is going to understand it, and even just help identify them. So, and as I said before, even having looked at the guidelines, we didn't spot, or maybe didn't give enough weight to some of the ways our system was at risk of departing from those LDAC guidelines. So it's a really good starting point, I think, to how much should we be thinking about this particular issue? Is it that we're pretty close, or is it that we're quite far away? That would be one key way to that it helps think about it.
And how did you use them? Because I made the point before, this is kind of not like reading War and Peace. You don't need to read the whole novel. So how did that process work for you guys?
Yeah, like any good kind of textbook or similar, you dip in, you go to the contents and go, yeah, I reckon it looks like it's this chapter, and dive in and have a look. I mean, they're written in really good plain English, so I think you don't have to be a lawyer to understand them. It really helps.
Yeah.
I would often, I would get my policy advisor to be like, go and look up the LDAC guidelines about this, come back and tell me what it says. That's the kind of way I would dip into them now.
That's useful, and even then you can sort of get from the headline plus the kind of brief description of what the guideline is, whether or not it's relevant or not, and move quite quickly. One final question before I ask you all one final question to Stacey, and that is, how has this engagement with LDAC helped the relationship between the legal teams and the policy teams in terms of moving forward in a way that actually gets good legislative design?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's why I asked it.
Yeah. Our policy and legal teams have really great working relationships already, which counts for a lot. I think the value is it's not just your policy team going to the LDAC meeting. It's your lawyers that are either in the legislation team, key contacts with PCO, plus your lawyers that are subject matter experts on those particular proposals. So you're all hearing the same message, and then you're able to debrief immediately after the meeting and figure out where to from here. So I think it helps with that collaborative way of working, and people collectively trying to solve the problem. And if there's a policy action, we can do it. If there's an illegal action, they will do it. So again, it relates back to that efficient process. But yeah, importantly, it does go to culture and ways of working and having that real team approach, because legislation can be tricky, but it's also actually quite exciting, and I think it's a real privilege to be in such a role where you are designing either new things or mending existing regulation, and to be doing that alongside of others is quite something.
Yeah, it's nice too, in the sense that I do think at times there are policy teams that think the legislation design stuff's just a legal issue, and the legal team will deal with it. And some of these processes help the policy teams to be more on that kind of same page in terms of what that legislation design means and the implications for policy. So I'm going to wrap this up, but before I do that, I'm going to turn to each of you and ask one last question, and that is, if you were on that mythical LDAC marketing team, and you could leave our audience today with just one message, and a message that actually would benefit from them in terms of their engagement with LDAC and even thinking about it, what would that one message be? And I'm going to turn to Stuart first.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. I like the concept of us as kind of critical friends. I mentioned that earlier. We're there to help, to demystify what legislative design, what good legislative design is, and to help solve the really difficult problems that come up when you're designing legislation. So, you know, we're all there to try and help, and yeah, really encourage people to reach out to us.
Now, Stacey, same question. You're on our Mythical marketing team, and you're selling LDAC in engagement, and you want to leave that one last message with our audience today. What would it be?
Start simple and go to the LDAC guidelines. They're really digestible. You don't have to read the whole thing. Focus on the chapters that are relevant to the proposals that you're working on. Provides you a really good insight into an easy way to work through legislative design.
And the final word on the key takeaway goes to Beth.
Okay, so I would take a bit of a different approach. I really love the concept of regulatory policy as being a specialization within policy and kind of a specialist profession on its own. I reckon that for people who, like you probably heard that I consider myself regulatory policy, kind of that's my specialization. This LDAC is one of your key stakeholders. They are one of the key bodies that will really help you to step up in how your sophistication in thinking about legislation. And so, I mean, that for me, it's the opportunity to work with people who can help me and my team lift our game. That's the cool part.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The policy community is relatively small, and the regulatory policy community is even smaller. So the more you widen that circle in the way you've talked about, the better it is, and the more friends you've got, to pick up Stuart's point.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. I think the discussion today has provided a good overview of how engagement with LDAC looks and what the benefits are. Now, if the technological wizardry works, a short poll should be appearing on your screen now, if not shortly. And if you can complete that and provide feedback on the session today and give any suggestions for what you'd like us to cover in future webinars, that would be fantastic. If the poll doesn't show on the screen, you'll be able to access it through the chat function before you leave the webinar, or it might even be sent out to you. We encourage you to explore the LDAC legislation 2021 edition of the guidelines and the resources available on the LDAC website. We look forward to seeing some of you at LDAC meetings in the future. So if you could fill in the survey, that would be great. And look out for our next webinar. We'll let you know once we have set the date and the topic for this. And if you could help us with telling us what sort of topics would be helpful, that would be useful too. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Ka kite anō.